Everyone, thank you so much for attending the Theory of Life podcast. Once again, we have John Brided back. John, introduce the topic. Tell us about yourself again.
All right. The reason why talking about this or introducing the topic again and introducing myself is we have
Yes.
a nasty tech issue. But
Yes.
so the topic today, we're covering the argument from desire from the author C.S. Lewis, and a little bit about myself. I'm a friend of Wade's, first and foremost, and I am a philosophy student. I'm wrapping up a master's at Holy Apostles Seminary. Should be wrapping that up in August. And said before to Wade that my current research for one of my projects is kind of the antithesis of what we're covering today. I'm actually writing a defense of naturalism in my philosophy of science class. But back to the topic at hand. Today
That's
we're
so awesome.
going to be going over the argument from desire.
Yeah.
So before I actually say what the argument for desire is, I want to start by saying there are debates over how to best understand the argument from desire. Some understand it as an argument against naturalism. Some see it as an argument for the existence of heaven. Some see it as an argument for the existence of God. And in my opinion, I think it's best understood as an argument for God's existence. But
Yeah.
as I said, we haven't actually defined what it is first,
Yeah.
or defined what it is yet. So I'm going to provide what I think is the most succinct statement of the argument. It's from
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. And Lewis says the following: If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world. And according to the philosopher Joe Puckett Jr., the argument from desire basically affirms that every natural and universal desire has an object that exists that satisfies that desire.
Hmm.
When we find that humans have a desire for God or transcendence, then there must be a God or something like God that exists.
Okay.
Anything about that so far that you want to
Well,
talk about?
that's good. I mean, I was just going to mention I did like some light 15-minute research. This argument crops up in The Pilgrim's Regress. And so this is a really cool quote. It sounds very fancy and like mind bending, but it's like really interesting when you read it or listen to it. To have it, okay, to have it is by definition a want. To want it is, oh, I can't even read it. Okay, I'm going to restart. Oh my goodness, I cannot read this. To have it is by definition a want. To want it, we find, is to have it. Right? And that's very fascinating. And he brings it up in Mere Christianity, as you said, and the problem of pain and the weight of glory. So it's permeated throughout his work. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I just want to provide a comment from the philosopher Peter Kraft on the argument from desire. According Peter Kraft is like a mainstream Catholic philosopher who's done a lot of work in apologetics. And
Yeah.
in reference to the argument from desire, Kraft said, outside of Anselm's ontological argument, Lewis's argument from desire is the most interesting argument in the history of human thought. And I'm tempted. I don't want to say I fully agree with Crave's assessment there, but I'm tempted
Yeah.
to say it definitely is one of the most interesting arguments in the history of philosophy. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
I mean, like, one thing to say, like, it's interesting, like, how plausible the argument is, given that it came from. I don't want to make C.S. Lewis seem like a bad thinker because he's a great thinker, but he's not like quite an analytic philosopher, right? So to have this argument come from him and it be in my by my lights that plausible, like I think that's really impressive. Like
no, I
actually,
actually think we could probably do a whole other podcast on uh, how we should understand C.S. Lewis as a philosopher, because
mm,
um,
yeah,
there's been countless books written on C.S. Lewis as a philosopher, and I actually think he's a very underrated philosopher because
mm,
we live in an age of analytic philosophy that sometimes is snobbish in the way that
yeah,
thinkers from the past. But I think that C.S. Lewis actually has a lot to offer, even to current day analytic philosophers. But
yeah.
that
Okay,
I wanted to provide a little bit of the history of the argument
yeah,
itself,
yeah. Please, yeah,
because I think it does predate Lewis.
yeah,
Also, I want to start also say that Wade and I are not experts in this argument, so take what we
What are
say.
you talking about? I am the number one expert in this conversation. What are you even saying?
Oh, that is true. I forgot about that. But so all that what Wade and I say with a grain of salt. But
Yeah.
as far as I know, at least the initial seed of the argument from desire is found in St. Augustine's Confessions, where he said, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find the your until they find their rest in you." You also find a formulation of the argument from desire in the philosophical theologian Nicholas Cusa, who wrote in the 1400s. And likewise, you find argumentation within Kierkegaard and Pascal that gesture towards the argument from desire.
Yeah.
So, why is the argument from desire associated most strongly with C.S. Lewis? Well, yeah, I don't know if you know this, Wade, but Lewis never actually referred to the argument from desire in his writings. Like
Yeah.
he never went, "This is the argument from desire."
Yeah.
Um, do you actually know where the name argument from desire came from?
I don't know. Where did it come from?
So it actually came from a philosopher who criticized Lewis's work.
Okay. Okay.
A philosopher named, I'm going to butcher his last name. It's uh, John Beverlew, I think is how the last name is pronounced. But
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
he wrote a book in the 80s called C.S. Lewis in the Search for Rational Religion. And that book is a critical assessment of Lewis's overall apologetic project. It's a
Okay.
critical assessment of Lewis's arguments for God. And Bovaris coined the phrase argument from desire, uh,
Yeah.
argument from desire for an argument that he found in Lewis's work for the
Yeah.
existence of God. And you mentioned the Pilgrim's Regress as
Yeah.
one of the books where the argument from desire is found. And as far as I could tell, um, the argument from desire, or something like the argument from desire, is found in C.S. Lewis's books Till We Have Faces, Paraland, The Pilgrim's Regress, uh, I think more than one of the Chronicles of Narnia, Mere
Okay.
Christianity, The Weight of Glory,
Yeah.
Joy, and The Problem of Pain.
Mm.
And the one theme that ties this argument from desire, if we're going to call it that, together in all of Lewis's work is that humans possess a desire for transcendence that can
Yeah.
only have one plausible source. And
Yeah.
anything on that, or do you want me to keep going?
That's fair. I mean, what one thing I wanted to like ask about, unless you had more specific on the
Sure.
like the history or whatever, but I was wondering. So I sent you a little prompt about maybe a structure, and I have C.S. Lewis context, right? And I imagine that might be a little bit confusing, but like what I mean by that is what was his emotional context? Like where was he at when he was writing that? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because like
So
in a group observed or surprised,
emotional,
yeah,
little autobiography. Like the argument from desire, in my opinion, um, is actually a kind of a reflection of how Lewis viewed his Christianity. Um,
okay,
so Lewis Lewis talked about when he was a very young boy, like he loved fantasy. He loved fantasy deeply, and when he read fantasy, like stuff about fairy tales, it it gave him a sense of transcendence and like childlike wonder.
yeah,
And throughout the rest of his adolescence and young adulthood, he wanted something that could recapture that sense of wonder and transcendence that he
mm,
experienced as a young child reading fantasy, reading fairy tales. And for C.S. Lewis, when he finally became a Christian, and that'd be a whole interesting podcast in and of itself. Throughout his writings, you find that his conversion to Christianity actually helped him recapture that childlike wonder, that
mm,
transcendence, that sense that there's something more, that longing for a happily ever after that he got
mm,
read fairy tales and fantasies. Is that the kind of context you're?
yeah, yeah. No, 100%. That's very interesting. I didn't know that.
So like, yeah, no, he was. In fact, we talked about whether he was a philosopher or not. He was. He actually taught, I think, at Oxford as a philosophy tutor briefly. Um, but after he was a philosophy tutor, he was primarily a medieval literature professor, and so he was very familiar with like the folklore and the fairy tales, the medieval era, the poetry. Um, But what was I going to say? I lost my train of thought there. All that to say, Lewis loved fantasy, and
Yeah.
he loved fairy tales. And for Lewis, fairy tales were something for him as a child, and even into his adulthood. His love for fairy tales, he thought, was actually a reflective of a longing for transcendence that all humans
Mm.
have.
Okay.
But now that we've given some context for like
Yeah.
Lewis and the argument from desire, we've done a little bit of historical context for
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
came from. I want to provide an expanded quotation on the first Lewis quote I gave about, if I find within myself a desire,
Yeah.
nothing else in this world can satisfy. Um, I think the quote that I have here actually provides a really nice summary of the argument from desire.
Yeah.
I think this might be from the Weight of Glory, or yeah, I think it's from the Weight of Glory. Lewis
Okay.
said, "Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel
Yeah.
desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Perhaps earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, only to arouse it to suggest the real thing." Now, I said that was from The Weight of Glory. I actually think it's from Mere Christianity. But I think
Yeah.
that quote actually expands on the argument from desire.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so no, I think that brings up a helpful distinction we're going to bring up later, right? And there's a distinction between natural desires and desires that come somehow else. And I might refer to them as desires that are grounded in experience, right? As opposed to innate desires. But
Sure.
I think that distinction is going to be really, really key because that's going to be the difference between a baby desiring food and a 5-year-old desiring to ride a unicorn. And that's going to be a really important distinction. That's going to clarify tons of
Absolutely.
objection. So,
So
yeah.
I want to expand on how I understand what Lewis is saying in the quote. Um,
Yeah, sure.
I think what Lewis is saying is that all of our earthly desires, such as desire for food, water, or sex, all have objects that exist that can
Yeah.
satisfy desires. But Lewis is also saying there likewise exists within all people a desire for transcendence that does not seem to have a earthly object that exists that can satisfy the desire.
Yeah.
And if all of our earthly desires have an earthly object that can satisfy these desires, perhaps our desire for transcendence likewise has a transcendent object, namely God, who exists, who can satisfy this longing for
Yeah.
So that's how I understand the argument
That's
in
fair. Yeah, that's pretty much how I understand it too, right? So I've had like I have your versions of the arguments, then I have like Lewis's and a bunch of. I don't actually have Lewis's here, but I have a bunch of. So
yeah.
I we
Oh,
so that's good.
I just wanted to say there really isn't, as far as I could tell, like any kind of analytic formulation of the argument in any of Lewis's works.
No,
It's kind of just usually it's something that's said in passing,
yeah,
but I actually have a couple of different formulations of the argument if you want to go through them before.
yeah, yeah. Well, so I mean, I think before we get into the argument, there's one last thing I want to go over, and you mentioned it earlier, but like, how should we think of this argument? Like, should we think of it analytically, or should we be looser when it comes to logic and maybe kind of like feel it a little bit more? You know what I'm
I
saying?
don't know what you mean by feel it a little bit more. Like
Well, I
no, like I
yeah,
no, I'm just messing with you. So should we understand it analytically? Should we use the word continental and
I
like
was thinking, but I was like, that's not quite right. I
um,
don't know.
so I I actually think we should maybe talk about that towards the end of the podcast,
That's fair.
because then I could give how I actually best think the argument should be used or applied.
That's fair.
Uh,
Okay.
do you want to go?
I mean, I'm pretty sure we're both actually kind of approaching it a little bit analytically. So like that might be the approach here, and if it's not, that's completely fine. And then we can address it later. Yeah,
Okay,
100%.
I won't give any spoilers.
No,
But
no.
before we get to how I understand the argument, I do want to provide some more analytic formulations of the argument.
Good, great, Sarah.
Um, I think this formulation comes from Peter Kraft. This is the formulation that I have here. It says premise 1, every natural desire in us corresponds to a real object that can satisfy that desire. Premise 2, there exists in us a natural desire that nothing in this world can satisfy. Conclusion, there is something beyond the world that can satisfy this desire.
Yeah.
That's one formulation. The second formulation I have here, I think, comes from the philosopher Paul Gould, and it's premise 1, our natural desires have a corresponding object that satisfies them. Premise 2, there exists in us a natural desire, the desire for transcendence, that nothing in the material cosmos can satisfy.
Mm-hmm.
3, there exists some object beyond the material cosmos that can satisfy this desire. Premise 4, the transcendental object of our longings is God.
God, yeah. Therefore, God.
God exists.
Mm-hmm.
The last formulation I have here, this is my personal favorite as far as like analytic formulations are concerned. It's from the
Yes, sir.
Sloan Lee in the amazing book. I'm going to put a I'm going to put a plug into it. They're about to make like the third edition of this book. It's like C.S. Lewis as philosopher. The edition
Okay.
I currently have doesn't exist anymore, except for maybe
Okay.
but they're making a third edition, C.S. Lewis as philosopher. When it drops, if it hasn't dropped already, it's a book that all of you lovely people should purchase.
All three people in my audience.
That's right. But
Oh,
favorite formulation of the argument from desire comes from the philosopher Sloan Lee in the second edition of C.S. Lewis, as of the second edition of the book C.S. Lewis is philosopher. And here's the formulation. Premise 1, we have good reason to think that all of our natural desires have existing objects that satisfy those desires. Premise 2, there exists in most people a natural desire, that is, the inconsolable longing, which is satisfied by neither anything within the range of sensory experience nor anything in the natural world. Conclusion, therefore we have good reason to think that something exists beyond the range of sensory experience and beyond the natural world that can satisfy the inconsolable longing. Those are the various formulations that I have, and also
yeah.
I can include these two, but there's a free paper that you can find called A Bayesian Exploration of C.S. Lewis's Argument from Desire,
Oh boy.
or is a Bayesian approach to the argument, and we are not getting into reading in this podcast for the sake of myself and the sake of your audience. Also, in the book Two Dozens or So Arguments for God, there is a modal formulation of the argument from desire, almost
Hey.
modal, like a combination of the modal and logical
Yeah.
argument from desire.
There's like modal versions of every single argument for God.
That
It's possible that there was a fine tuner. It's possible there was a beginning of the
hey,
universe.
if you
Okay.
if you find within yourself a desire for a being who exists in all possible worlds, then you know. But yeah, those are very
So that's those modal things make me so mad. But no, it's interesting because I actually like thought about that a little bit, and in my process of thinking, I was like trying to figure out like, well, why think that just because we desire something that means it exists? And like at the very beginning stages, I was thinking, well, maybe our desires at least demonstrate possibility. But then right before the podcast, it brought me back to a conversation I had with Ben about conceivability and possibility. And like I actually told Ben, I haven't talked to you about this. It's interesting, but I think if you say that conceivability entails possibility, you arrive at a contradiction because it is conceivable that God exists, inconceivable that God doesn't exist. And if conceivability means possibility, then that means it's possible God exists and it's not possible God exists, which means God exists and God doesn't exist, which is a contradiction.
well.
So,
If
yeah.
theism is true, then no. Anyway, that's
Yeah.
another conversation.
Well,
But you asked
yeah.
me earlier in this podcast, and you also asked me through text messages, like how we should think about the argument. Should we think about it analytically in a continental?
Yeah.
And unless you want to talk about some of the formulations that I brought through, I
Yeah. Well, so I mean, yeah, we can save whatever the continental thing. We can say that to the end because you wanted to talk about, the way you view the argument. We
yeah.
can talk about.
So
Um,
so
yeah.
I think the arguments that or the formulations that I went over, I think that those arguments at a bare minimum show that the argument can be formulated in sophisticated and thought provoking ways.
Yes.
But I don't ultimately see the argument from desire so much as an argument, but rather I see it as an invitation to commitment. or a commitment to viewing reality through the lens of existential hope and not existential hopelessness. And
Okay.
before I explain what I mean by existential hope and existential hopelessness, I want to talk about homesickness generally.
Okay.
Um, Throughout my time as a college student, I missed my home terribly. I'm from Rhode Island originally. That's currently where I live.
Yeah.
I went to school in South Carolina, and my university was 900 miles away from Rhode Island,
Hmm.
and so I often found myself just missing home terribly.
Yeah.
But I think that the argument from desire is gesturing toward what I call an existential homesickness that I think we all feel at some point in our lives. It's a desire for a home that we do not appear to possess the zip code for, or at. And also, I think another way of understanding it is if you've ever had to spend time with someone you deeply care about that you know you're not going to see for a while, or perhaps you may never see them again. That feeling of longing that you have in that moment is I think another way of capturing what Lewis is trying to convey. So it's this idea, like I said, of an existential homelessness, and let me
Mm.
elaborate more on that. Because I love I love, as a side note, I love existentialism. Wade knows that. So that's really influencing how I understand the argument. But when
Yeah.
I talk about existential homelessness, what do I mean? I I mean that we don't want love to end. We don't want lies to trump truth. We don't want ugliness to ultimately trump beauty. We don't want evil to ultimately triumph over goodness.
Hmm.
This
Yeah.
homesickness for a reality where love never ends, where truth always triumphs over lies, beauty always triumphs over ugliness, and goodness triumphs over evil. And what
Yeah.
I mean by the argument from desire being a commitment to existential hopefulness is it's this idea that we experience the experience that the argument from desire is speaking about or talking about. I actually see it as like a call to faith. And by faith, I mean
Mm.
commitment. Commitment to a belief that one day love will never end. One day truth will ultimately prevail over lies. Beauty will ultimately prevail over ugliness. And goodness
Yeah.
will ultimately prevail over evil. And this call to faith, this call to commitment is ultimately, in my estimation, not a call to certainty about God's existence or the existence of heaven, but rather a commitment to hope that a good God does in fact exist and that there
Mm.
will ultimately be a place where love, truth, beauty, and goodness will never end. But if what I just described is a commitment to viewing reality through the lens of existential hopefulness, I want to compare and contrast what it looks like to view reality through the lens of existential hopelessness. And for that, I've got a long quote from my homeboy Albert Camus,
Okay.
one of the best existentialist absurdist philosophers.
Oh, boy.
But he has a quote that says, "What then is that incalculable feeling that deprives the mind of the sleep necessary to life? A world that can be explained, even with bad reasons, is a familiar world. But on the other hand, in a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. His exile is without remedy, since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. The divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity."
Mm.
So, from Camus' perspective, humans do possess a longing for transcendence, or what Lewis called the argument for desire, or what is called the argument from desire. But according to Camus, our longing for transcendence ultimately cannot be satisfied. From Camus' perspective, we ultimately long for a home with no zip code or address, for it is a longing for a home that does not exist. And
Mm.
that's how I understand the argument, and that's how I see the inverse of the argument, as it were. I know I said a lot there, but
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean it's difficult trying to find a place to step in, I suppose. I mean, I don't want to like already jump to. I felt like this might be a topic we would address later on, but I mean, I suppose we can just address it now. Like,
sure,
what exactly is the desire directed towards, right? So, I mean, I don't want to jump into objections, but I suppose this
sure.
was an objection. But I mean, I guess it's just something we could talk about. I mean, like, what is the thing that we desire? And you said something actually earlier about C.S. Lewis being really interested in fantasy and how that cultivated some kind of transcendent experience or whatever. I mean, like, not to be reductionistic, I suppose, but I actually kind of feel like maybe he just got what he wanted in that situation, right? Maybe he just does desire a fantasy world, right? All you have to do is just kind of like, I don't know, write books, and like then the desire actually is satisfied. So maybe there is something to be satisfied here. You're watching movies, engaging with art, beautiful art, whatever that might be. The thing is, it doesn't last forever, right? But who said our desire is for something that's infinite? Right? Maybe it's not a desire for something infinite. Maybe it's desire that comes and then it comes again when we get it and forget about it. I don't know. Just some idea.
No, and that's an objection worth thinking through. But I suppose I have a couple of thoughts on that. One, Lewis is Lewis actually in his writings, he speaks about the that longing for transcendence as something that is, at least in this life, perpetually unsatisfied. It's
Yeah.
where perhaps one of the quotes I included at the beginning, he said, "You find hints of it in our experiences of joy that we have in this lifetime." But for Lewis, none of our earthly experiences, even if they hint at satisfying this longing for transcendence, even if they provide a trailer for what the final
Yeah.
in Lewis's estimation, none of those experiences could ultimately satisfy or bring satisfaction to that longing for
Yeah.
transcendence. Now, that doesn't mean that therefore God exists, but just to understand what Lewis's point was,
Yeah.
but also at least what I see in Lewis, and just Christian theology more broadly, that desire for transcendence is something that has to be cultivated. It's something that has to be expanded upon
Fair.
our own, because
Fair.
it's actually something uh, that, from Lewis's perspective and Christian theology more broadly, it's a desire that can be muted, or it's a desire
Mm.
that can be resisted.
Yeah.
So
Suppressed, if you
something that can
will.
be suppressed. So it's not just something that you feel at every waking moment, but according to Lewis, there are moments where all of us come face to face with this, even if God doesn't exist. So take God out of the equation for a moment, but all of us come face to face with this longing for transcendence.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I think that opens a little can of worms here, right? Because I actually, at work, I was thinking about this argument. And I was thinking of different kinds of dissatisfaction. I kind of want to nail down the point C.S. Lewis makes about we get glimpses of the things that we want, but we don't really get the thing itself, right? And so I have written down here. There's three paths of dissatisfaction, right? So one is we don't get what we want, right? So like maybe a kid wants Santa Claus to bring them something, and then they just don't, and then they're just dissatisfied. So that's one way to be dissatisfied. Another way is we get tired of the thing that we have, right? And so like let's say we really want Oreos, right? So we go to the fridge. I mean, refrigerated Oreos are great. So like you go to the fridge and you get refrigerated Oreos and you eat them, and like, but the desire dies away once you have it, and you're like that's actually not a great example. A better example would be getting a Lego set or something you really want, right? And you're playing with it, right? But then after a while, you get kind of tired of it, and it's like, well, I got what I wanted and I was satisfied, but like it's there's nothing left anymore really. And then the third kind is similar to the first one. We get what we want. We get what we let's see. We think we get what we want, but it's actually what we. I can't even read. Okay, we think what we. Oh my gosh, can I read?
It's okay. We'll edit
we
this out later.
we think we get what we want, but it's not actually what we thought it was, right? And so I think this was the point C.S. Lewis was getting at, right? So the idea is we want something. This thing is transcendence, and we think transcendence is located somewhere in reality. Like maybe it's in a relationship, maybe it's in a career, maybe it's in working out, maybe it's in pursuing goals. But actually, it's just not there, right? So there's kind of an illusion there, right? An analogy might be something like, let's say, I mean, what would be an analogy for that? Um,
Um, the person who longs to be a millionaire and they think once they finally get it rich, once they finally, strike it big in a rich,
yeah,
but then they feel empty inside.
yeah. So they thought happiness was located inside of richness, but they were just wrong about that. Like the object of their desire to be happy was not located in richness, right? So that's interesting, right? And so if that's what's happening with transcendence, if it is the case that transcendence, the desire for transcendence, is one natural, and also there is a desire for transcendence, if that is the case, and we're pursuing it, but we're just wrong about what things contain transcendence, right? Then yeah, I think the argument kind of gets off the ground, right? But I'm not sure. There's reason to be skeptical that that's kind of the experience that we have. Maybe we're dissatisfied for other reasons when it comes to transcendence, for the other two reasons, perhaps. I don't know.
That that is an interesting objection that our desire for what we think is transcendence is misplaced, or
Yeah.
uh, or mistakenly. How did you word? I like the way you worded it at the very end. Can can you reword that again?
Hmm. Well, so I think what Lewis is saying is that we believe that certain things contain transcendence within them, but we're just wrong about that, right? And so if it turns out that we're pursuing all of these things we think, are transcendent, we're just wrong, and maybe that's evidence that it's beyond the world, right? But also maybe we don't desire transcendence. Maybe these profound experiences of disappointment come from just not getting what we want or from getting tired of things, right? Who knows?
Okay, okay. So there's that last part. So I actually don't think that's what Lewis is meaning by transcendence, and I get that. I get that you understand that and believe that too. But I don't think he's wrong about humans longing for transcendence. Especially, one of the analogies I used was the analogy of having to say goodbye to someone you care about deeply, knowing that you're not going to see them for a while, or perhaps it's a situation where maybe they're dying of cancer and you know that that's going to be the last time, at least in this life, that you're going to see them. But that feeling of fleetingness in that moment where you don't want the love to end, I think actually is desire for something eternal or something that is transcendent. And I don't think, unless one applies reductionism to those moments, which it is possible the reduction.
Yeah.
I don't think that reductionism gets at what Lewis is talking about when we have those profound moments where, in the instance of having to say goodbye to a loved one, there's a desire for that love to never end, a desire for that love not to be a fleeting thing. But
Yeah.
but we come face to face with the fact that as finite creatures, we are just like finitude is just part of the game, and fleetingness is just.
Hmm.
And yet, if Lewis is correct, we find ourselves for a longing that cannot be contained by finitude or fleetingness. We desire for something permanent.
Okay, so that's interesting, right? So it does seem clear that we desire infinite things, right? And so it if it turns out that that desire is innate and natural, then the argument goes through. But there's still a question of like, what does infinity mean in this context? But
Sure,
that's a separate.
sure.
Um, but maybe we should kind of talk a little bit about the distinction between the two different kinds of desires here, right? Because I'm just not convinced, at least in this present state. I could be convinced otherwise. I don't know. I'm skeptical that our desire for eternity is an innate desire, right? Because like I was just thinking of a world. Let's say we lived in a world where infinity wasn't even a concept. Like it wasn't coherent in our minds, right? Like would we desire anything to be infinite, right? And if the answer is no to that, then there might be some evidence it's not a natural desire. Maybe we desire infinity because we've conceptualized infinity and we take good things, prolong them infinitely, and we're like, oh man, I want that thing, and that might be what grounds our desire for it.
I I don't know, and this isn't not me trying to be dodgy. How much I want to change the possible world scenario? How much I want to chase the possible world scenario you gave?
Okay.
Mostly because it's like assuming that there are creatures at least analogous to us who were created by someone or something. Like, if there is a God who exists and created these creatures, I'm not sure if like something about perfect being theism is true, that he would be able to create creatures who don't long to be connected to God.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why I'm not.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. Yeah.
But do you want to talk about why, what evidence we might have that this desire is for God, or that if the desire is for God, that desire in and of itself is evidence for God, or where do you want to take the discussion?
Well, yeah. Maybe we could step away from that infinity thing for a second. 'Cause I actually did have some notes on that. I mean, I think it might just be helpful to yeah, let's draw a distinction between these desires. So, because I honestly, like the first question that comes to mind that we haven't really fully addressed yet, but when someone first interacts with this argument, I know like when I first did, I mean, what most people do, probably the first question is, well, like, I mean, we desire a lot of things. That doesn't mean they're real. Like a 5-year-old can desire a unicorn. That doesn't mean unicorns are real. And so it's kind of like an immediate defeater. But no, I believe there is some fine print in this argument worth reading. So what do you how would you respond?
I see when Lewis is talking about natural desires. I think he's talking about desires that are natural to human nature, like
Yeah,
desires that would be true of a human living in the Jurassic era and true of a human living in 2025. So
yeah,
desires that are a part of human nature just in general
yeah,
across time and across different contexts. So it's
yeah,
so they're desires that are innate to all human beings by virtue
yeah,
of what we are. Human beings by virtue of what we are, as Lewis said, we desire things like food and sex, love, fill in the blank. And these
yeah,
desires that he talks about, unlike a desire for a unicorn from a 5-year-old, these are desires
yeah,
that are innate human beings by virtue of what a human being is, by virtue
yeah,
of what the nature of a human being is.
yeah, yeah. I think that's fair, and I think if it turns out that transcendence is that kind of desire, then like that's really fascinating. Um, no, I think there was something that I had here. So this is kind of a weird objection. I just came up with it the other day, and like I'm just kind of toying with it. So we desire happiness, right? Um, it seems as though there is an object of that desire, happiness. Happiness exists somewhere, even if I'm not happy, right? But I can imagine it's not completely implausible that there would be a guy who desires happiness, his own happiness, and that's a hardwired desire, but he doesn't get it. He's just never happy, right? Like he deeply, naturally desires his own happiness, but his own happiness doesn't exist, right? And so we have a defeater for the principle that whatever natural desires we have objects. So like, but there seems something fishy about that. I don't know.
Can you elaborate on that? Like, you say he desires his own happiness, but
Yeah,
but the object that would be needed for his own happiness doesn't exist. Is that what you're saying?
yeah. So maybe it's kind of implausible to think that every single person has. Well, there is. It's implausible to think that there are some people that have never experienced any amount of happiness. Like I'm pretty sure everyone's experienced some amount of happiness, right? So maybe we can take like sex or something. Who knows? Like there's people out there who desire to have sex. Like they desire themselves to have sex. They don't desire sex in general. Why are we saying the word sex a lot? It's fine. Anyway, they desire their own.
You're gonna get this video flagged, Wade.
Yeah, I'm gonna get this video flagged. But the thing is, I mean, we have virgins in the world. People die virgins. This is a reality, right? So the object of their desire, their own experience of sex, was not satisfied, even though it was a natural
That's
desire.
true. However, sex exists, though. That
Sex in general.
sex in general exists, but the argument from desire is not saying that all people are going to end up finding happiness. Rather, it's saying,
No, 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 it's not. Mm-mm.
or satisfaction of their transcendent longing. But rather, it's saying that the object does in fact exist. And in your analogy, sex does in fact exist. However, that like certain virgins may never experience it. But that doesn't mean that.
Well, all virgins wouldn't experience.
Well,
I
well,
definitely.
I do know that. I'm just saying that certain
Yeah, no.
virgins won't lose their virginity. Is my only point. But because certain virgins exist who won't get to experience sex, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Is my only point.
Yeah. So the
So
idea.
I think it's possible to have an unfulfilled desire, but the object of that desire still exists, and it's possible that you could have had that desire satisfied, but for whatever reason you weren't able to.
No, so I agree with that, right? But my specific objection is that this person desires his own experience of sex. Like that, the object of his desire is not sex generally, it's his own experience of it, or him engaging in it, however you want to cast that out. And that itself is a natural desire. The specific object is his own experience, right? But that might not exist, right? And so I don't know.
I don't know if it's I don't know if it's analogous enough to be a defeater for the argument from desire, because there's a lot that would be involved in that individual satisfying that desire. One, actually talking to another person and developing a relationship. So I just don't know if there's enough that's analogous between that thought experiment and Lewis's argument to serve as a defeater for the argument, if that makes sense.
Well, maybe okay. I actually wrote down my own formulation of the argument, and I think it's pretty similar. Um, and I want to plug this objection into this argument and see how it works. So my argument is fundamental desires or natural desires are directed towards realities. Our desire for transcendence is a fundamental desire. Therefore, our desire for transcendence is directed towards a reality, right? So that's kind of the way that I think about it, right? And so in this, maybe we should stop using sex as an example. Let's say
The audience would appreciate that, I'm sure.
let's say there's this infant, right, that desires food tomorrow, right? So the object of their desire is their consumption of food tomorrow. It's not merely food in general, right? It's well, now that I think about it, that might just be a combination of a natural desire and a desire that comes from experience, right? Because it's not just a natural desire there.
But I think to your point, they may have their own personal desire for food, but there also is a desire for food generally. And I think your
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
if their explicit desire for, let's say, peanut butter, like isn't fulfilled, not just their desire for food generally, but maybe a desire for a specific food or food
Yeah,
specifically that.
that wouldn't be innate. That would not be innate.
Yeah. I think that's more so. And again, this isn't like attacking you. It's more so being pedantic, not necessarily getting at the heart.
So I know I feel pedantic, but the thing is, like, okay, so if it is the case that our natural desires are directed towards reality, if that is true, then we would expect our desire for our own satisfaction to exist. But sometimes it doesn't. So this serves as a defeater for the general principle. So like literal. If I don't want to beat a dead horse too much, we can move on soon. Like the actual object of our desire is our own satisfaction. But sometimes that doesn't even exist. You know?
That is true if it's your object for a specific. Like, say you have a specific desire for pizza, not just food generally, but pizza. There
Yeah.
might not be a pizza in the other room waiting for you that can satisfy that desire. But I don't think that's necessarily the point of Lewis's argument. He's talking about a desire generally, but then again, pizza itself still exists, even if it doesn't exist specifically for that person in that moment.
No. So look. The reason we let's say someone desire. Okay, so the desire for pizza is not a natural desire, right? The
Sure.
desire for food is, right? Desire for pizza comes from experience, right? We learn what kinds of things can satisfy our fundamental natural desires, right? That's 100% fair, right? But like it just is a fundamental desire to have our own satisfaction, not satisfaction generally, right? Like, we don't have to experience anything in the world to desire our own satisfaction, but sometimes it doesn't happen. But maybe I don't want to beat
Yeah,
a dead horse there,
I think that we might be talking past each other, but if I do
Slight.
understand your argument, I still don't think it gets at the heart of what he's talking about natural desires. Um,
Maybe not. I probably need to think about it more because it's kind of a recent objection. But I think it does serve as a defeater. But I don't want to like bog down
my
this.
only point being, like, even if that desire can't be satisfied in that moment, that doesn't mean that the object of the desire doesn't exist. That's my only point. Like,
Well, if the object of the desire is to have it in that moment, and that is a natural desire,
well,
then it
but that says
defeater.
nothing about whether or not the thing exists, though. It just means whether or not the desire in that moment can be satisfied. So we're talking about two different.
Well, it does say something about it existing if it turns out to be a fundamental desire, right? Because like all fundamental desires have objects, right? As we
Yeah,
said before.
but if someone like fundamentally desires food, food as a concept exists, even if in all moments of hunger you can't satisfy the desire.
Yeah.
Food still exists, though.
And I mean, yeah, yeah. I think maybe we can shelf this.
Sure.
But
I get
maybe,
one maybe analogy. If someone's in the desert and they desire water, the natural desire for water is a natural desire in that moment. But that desire is not going to get satisfied if they're in the desert. Uh,
yeah.
but that doesn't mean that water as a concept doesn't exist. That's my only point.
No, I agree with that.
And I'm just saying that
Yeah.
if there are I can show it after this, but if there are
Yeah.
moments where your natural desires aren't satisfied, my only point being is there still is the possibility of that object being, or that desire being satisfied, even if it isn't in that moment. Because
Yeah.
I'm trying,
The possibility, but like not the actuality, I guess.
my only pushback would be is I don't think that serves as evidence is that the object as such doesn't exist. Ontological,
Yeah.
like,
I mean, like I agree with you. I mean, yeah, no, I mean, just because yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, maybe we could like call about that at some point, and
yeah,
like that's interesting.
sure.
Yeah, but anyway, for the podcast, we can just shelf that. I want to know what maybe if people are listening. I want to know what people think about that because I need to explore that more myself. So anyway, um, yeah, okay. So let's talk a little bit more about this little transcendence thing, right? So, John, maybe maybe your position doesn't make you do this, but I'm going to ask you to do it anyway. Bridge the gap between transcendence and God.
Bridge the gap between transcendence and God. You mean like why think that God is a
Yeah.
source of transcendence?
Or like why I think God is involved in transcendence.
Why I think God is involved in well, so I have independent reasons why I think that God is the source of truth, beauty, and goodness, which the medieval theologians and philosophers called the transcendentals. And because I think God is the source of truth, beauty, and goodness, I think when humans long for what they consider to be transcendent, I think that if God is the source of truth, beauty, and goodness, which are the transcendentals that underline transcendence, I believe that when we talk about humans desiring transcendence, we are talking about humans desiring God, if God as such is the source of truth, beauty, and goodness, or in the classical
Okay.
tradition, identical with truth, beauty, and goodness.
Okay, so let's construct this. I'm gonna ask you to do it because I don't want to do it on the spot. I'm gonna put you on the spot. Let's construct a scenario where we're desiring transcendence. And before you do that, while you're thinking about that, I was thinking about what emotions could contain the desire for transcendence in them. Because the word longing is used a lot, right? And that's not just a desire, right? That's something to do with emotion, right? And I was thinking about various different kinds of positive emotions, and like there's tons of them that don't involve a desire, but I kind of came across nostalgia, and there was something else. But I'm not sure joy might be considered desire, even though C.S. Lewis would disagree with that. But anyway, I mean, those thoughts, but also let's try to construct a scenario where we would desire transcendence. Like, what would that look like?
I think a good example would be witnessing a beautiful sunset or a beautiful sunrise, where I think aesthetic experiences just
Beauty. That's what it was. I wrote down
I
experience of beauty.
think
Yeah.
aesthetic experiences generally are a good way of understanding what Lewis is getting at. That feeling of being overwhelmed by beauty when you see a beautiful sunset or sunrise. And that, like, I've actually written a short essay on why I think uh, aesthetic experiences or aesthetic obligations, I actually think point towards the existence of God. But in aesthetic experiences, we experience something that is bigger than ourselves. We experience something beautiful that is beyond ourselves. Again, transcendence. When we see that sunrise, we don't want that moment to end. There's something, again, to use the word in the description, there's something transcendent about the sunset, transcendent about the sunrise, and something perhaps even worthy of worship in the sunrise. But that's a whole.
Well, it's kind of interesting, right? Because, like, well, C.S. Lewis does talk about, I think he makes this distinction, or maybe I made the distinction in my notes, between joy and other kinds of desires, right? So a lot of desires might be kind of painful, right? Because, we really want something, we don't have it, but like joy for some reason, like, we don't have the desire, but like, or maybe we do. But it's a really pleasurable experience, which is interesting. But on that line of thought, when I'm thinking about experiencing a sunset, I'm actually trying to struggle. I'm struggling to see where the desire is, right? Because I actually feel just kind of satisfied. You know what I mean? And but then
Sure.
again,
Okay, so
if
maybe
if if
maybe
if, if it's supposed to be a positive experience, you would expect me to feel satisfied. But maybe,
yes.
you know,
So let me clear a few things up. So experiences like the sunrise or sunset may not be good examples of what Lewis talks about when he talks about the unsatisfied desire. It could be
yeah,
in those moments that they are hints of ultimate transcendence, or they're gateways to transcendence, or windows to transcendence. Where when you see a sunset, you may be satisfied in the moment, like, yeah, I really enjoyed that experience. But you want to see another sunset. You don't just ever see one sunset and go, well, that's the only one. Yeah,
yeah,
that was
That's
okay.
true.
You see one sunrise, like, good enough. Like
Okay.
great philosopher mediocritus once said, good enough, right? No, you want. Sorry for the dad joke, but it's like when you experience a beautiful sunrise or a beautiful sunset, you want to see another one. But I think the better example for capturing what Lewis was getting at is like I used it twice already, but I think it's okay to use it again. It's the idea of having to say goodbye to someone that you care about deeply. You may have enjoyed the time you spent together with that person. It may have been pleasurable, but there's a fleetingness to that relationship and to that experience that kind of causes a pain within you, even if it's bittersweet, even if you're happy you had the experience with them, even if you're happy that you're with them in that moment, even if you uh, feel a sense of joy that you're with them, there's still in the midst of all of that a a pain or like a bittersweetness where it's I don't want this moment to end, but it's going to. And I think that experience is a good analogy for what Lewis is talking about when he's talking about the desire for transcendence or the desire for joy. Or it's we're in these moments where we do experience some degree of joy, but in the midst of that experience, there's also the presence of fleetingness that this experience is going to come to an end, even though we don't want it to. And what I think Lewis is getting at is we have a desire perhaps for a world or for a being that can ensure that love, truth, beauty, and goodness will never end.
So that's interesting. So maybe the object of our desire is something like a beautiful thing, but it's eternal. Um, kind of. That I don't know. You know, it, I wonder if it's. I know you turned it over to the C.S. Lewis, like the death example, but I kind of want to keep using the sunset. I mean, to me, as maybe a more reductionistic kind of thinker, I suppose, it might just be us desiring to see a sunset, then we go home, and then the desire is gone until we want it again, and then then it's gone. It's kind of like food. right? I mean, well, I suppose that might not be a good thing for what I'm saying. um,
But as I not to kind of preemptively try to block the objection I think you're going to give, as I mentioned earlier, the desire can be cultivated. The desire can
yeah,
be cultivated. The desire can also be suppressed as well, and
yeah.
also can be misdirected as well.
Okay, okay. So maybe it's a desire. Okay, okay. I'm kind of maybe seeing the plausibility here, right? So the object of our desire is just beauty in general, maybe in this particular instance of sunsets, and that might seem to be hardwired or something. Or okay, I mean that just seems plausible, I guess.
Not to cut you off, but how much time do we have, just so I can know what to?
There's no time limit. It's
Okay.
whatever.
Um,
Yeah, we're just throwing back ideas. Yeah.
do you want to? I know we're in like the freestyle section. Do you want to talk about like because I mentioned earlier that I don't see it ultimately necessarily as this like analytic argument, but more of like something more existential.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
we talked about that a lot already. Would you like to
Sure.
talk about? And I didn't have anything written down for this, but I think it'd be interesting where the argument from desire, like how it would perhaps, how do I want to word this? How it would fit into like the context of natural theology more generally, or the arguments for God's existence.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. Yeah.
I actually think so. If we're just going to talk about it as just an,
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah,
if we're just going to talk about an argument for God's existence, trying to like strip it of all of its existential content, which I think wouldn't work. But if we're just trying to
yeah.
look at it as like a bare logical argument, I actually think that in the context of natural theology, let's say you heard, William Lane Craig's case for God, you heard the contingency argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, a better formulation of the moral argument that William Lane Craig doesn't provide. But let's say you just hear the general case for God's existence
Hmm.
from natural theology, and you,
Yeah.
hey, that the arguments from evil seem powerful. The argument from divine hiddenness seems powerful, but I still can't shake the intuition that there might be a necessary being out there, or there might
Hmm.
be a perfect being out there, just
Yeah.
based on the weight of the arguments from natural theology. So, what do you do in that scenario if you find arguments from evil plausible, or an argument from hiddenness plausible, but you also perhaps think that the arguments from natural theology are maybe slightly more plausible than the
Yeah.
theological objections? I actually think where the argument from desire could come in is as a maybe a tiebreaker, where
Hmm.
you go, okay, I have strong reasons to think that God exists. I also likewise have strong reasons to believe that all of the natural or all my natural desires have some sort of object that exists that
Yeah.
satisfy those desires. So perhaps in this scenario, I've just been given a good case for why I should think God exists from natural theology. Perhaps I can respond to the argument from desire that I've experienced on many occasions, and maybe I'm experiencing it right now, with a commitment to God or religion. I think
Hmm.
that the argument from desire can perhaps serve as either a tiebreaker or just push one over the edge, as it were, towards theism, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. I mean, yeah, you can think of a few kind of arguments. Like I suppose maybe some religious experience might kind of fall in there. But it's interesting. I haven't really given my thoughts on the argument generally. I mean, there's vagueness in there, and there's still that one objection that seemed pedantic, but it's actually really bothering me, and I got to figure that out. But the argument as a whole is like really kind of compelling, and honestly, for me, it's a lot stronger than you know maybe contingency arguments get off the ground. But I don't want to have to read four texts by like Alex Proust to understand why there's necessary being, right? And you can just read the C.S. Lewis thing, think about it a little carefully, and be like, oh yeah, that's plausible, right? So I don't even know if it's like a merely a tiebreaker. I suppose
I
I'd put
I
it
I, I,
in
I think I think it's a strong argument independently in and of itself.
yeah.
I was just saying that let's say that you're more metaphysically minded and you're Joe Schmid, right? But but you
Yeah.
you do think that there's something to different cosmological arguments, contingency arguments,
Mm.
and you're trying to figure out, well, what should break this possible tie that exists. I think the argument from desire could serve as a tiebreaker. Also, I think
Yeah.
it also serves, I think, as a reason to investigate natural theology in the first place, where perhaps someone finds themselves in a situation where they're not sure if God exists or if God doesn't exist, but they find within themselves like that desire for transcendence. I think that if let's say theism's true and God is trying to draw people to himself in a non-coercive way, I also think the argument from desire could be a sort of natural knowledge of God or a
Yeah.
non-coercive drawing of God, where God is trying to move someone in a direction where they can see for themselves if God exists, if that makes sense, or they
Yeah.
exploring the questions where they it might even make other arguments from natural theology more plausible to that person, because I think part of what drives like our what we find plausibility or find plausible is, and you would agree with this, our desires.
Yeah.
We don't desire something to be true, it's going to really affect the plausibility of the truth claim we're investigating. And I think what the argument from desire could do is move a person towards investigating the truth claims of theism and potentially bring them to a place where they can positively say they have knowledge of God.
Yeah. That's very fascinating. I mean, like my mind's actually kind of looping back around to the sunset thing. Um, I mean, what if maybe the argument goes through, but the part that doesn't go through is that it's beyond this world. Like, what if, like, I don't know, transcendence is here, you know, and we do experience it when we go to a sunset,
The
you know?
only problem with that is unfortunately death exists too, like that kill
Okay.
that killjoy, literal killjoy. Um,
Yeah.
death exists and the party's over. So like I
Hmm.
Lewis would say that the reality of death would be a defeater to the idea that transcendence is here, transcendence is now, because it
Okay. So clearly we desire it to never end, right? So, but I'm wondering if that desire is natural. I wonder if that's just built into. I mean, like, I don't know. It seems as though once we've conceptualized, once we've like experienced the finitude of reality, and then we come up with the idea that, oh man, what if it didn't end? Once we've done that, then we can desire to think for things not to end. You know what I mean?
I
And that doesn't look like a natural desire to me.
do you want to talk about whether or not the desire for transcendence is a natural desire a little bit, or maybe
Yeah.
for thinking that. So,
Well, specifically in this context, I suppose the desire for transcendence could be a natural desire, but like maybe transcendence isn't infinite, right? Because
or
I'm skeptical,
reasons for thinking that it's infinite,
huh?
or do you want to talk about maybe some reasons for thinking that desire for transcendence is something that's infinite rather than finite?
Okay, let me try to formulate the objection again, and then you make a decision.
Sure. Yeah.
so, so the idea is that we desire beautiful things or meaningful things to not end, right? And presumably that would be the natural desire, right? So part of that is natural, right? So the natural desire is for maybe the beautiful thing, right? And then there's objects for that desire. I'm skeptical that the desire for the infinity of that thing is a natural desire. I wonder if like that comes through reasoning, through experience, much in the same way that a little girl's desire for fantasy or fun is innate, but the desire for specifically unicorn comes from the TV, right? That those two things would be analogous there, and so I'm wondering if our desire for the thing to never end is like the unicorn.
So I think it is innate and not something that is equivalent to the unicorn objection. And the reason that when you look at human history, the history of religion as a whole, uh, what motivates the like just from like an evolutionary standpoint, what motivates religious investigation? Well, fear of death. You and I would both agree that what motivates
Okay.
evolutionary standpoint is fear of death. Well, why is that? Well, if natural selection has hardwired us to, have survival value, well,
Hmm.
death is a pretty big impediment to survival value.
I think the fear of death necessitates the desire for eternity.
Exactly.
Perhaps
So
that okay. That
I actually think it's not
you.
hard. I actually think it's not hard to prove that we're evolutionary hardwired to not, desire at least not to die, or desire for eternal life in some way, shape, or form. Or maybe not eternal life. Maybe even make a more modest claim. Desire at least for death not to be the end.
That's a really great response. I don't know what to say. That's so
No, I'm
fascinating.
just saying, like, so you don't even have to say like eternal life, but at least like the more modest claim that we at least know from evolution that we desire for death not to be the end. Like, I think you and I could both agree.
So that's like trivial, and it just undermines what I'm saying. That's so great. That's so weird. I don't know how to. That's actually that makes the argument very. I haven't even in my think sessions through this argument. That is not something I like came up with at all. I would have spent like hours thinking about that. That's so fascinating.
No, I was saying that you could go down a reductionist route and say that, yeah, the reason why we pursue, take a few steps back. Like, if you take evolution in conjunction with naturalism, then our beliefs aren't aimed at truth. So our evolutionary hardwiring to be religious could come from fear of death. But since our beliefs aren't aimed at truth, then our desire for transcendence that's evolutionary hardwired into us may not have an object that satisfies that desire, if that makes sense. And we can explain the existence of the desire because, natural selection hardwired into us not to want to die. Um, and so, from a reductionistic standpoint, we could explain why the desire exists, but also why we don't have to necessarily think it leads to, belief in God or belief in an afterlife. Like, if I was going to put my reductionistic hat on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there might needs to be a little fine tuning when it comes to the distinction between different kinds of desires, because maybe we've just labeled a few desires, uh, or I had a thought. Where did it go? So there is something kind of implausible about our desire for eternal life just having an object. And that's not exactly what you were saying, but I mean a way I could spin it in the way that I think this argument is that we have a natural desire to not die, right?
Yeah.
And I think that we have inductive reason to think that our natural desires have objects, right? And so like food and sex and happiness and all this stuff, right? And so therefore that means there's eternality for at least some people, right? But there's something just kind of wrong about that, right? And so maybe we need to make a distinction between that kind of desire and other kinds of desires that have objects. And I'm not sure how to think about that.
Well, you could also,
Yeah,
like, if theism's true, you could also argue that God has evolutionarily hardwired us to want death not to be the end,
yeah,
want the party to keep on going, as it were. So I actually think perhaps, like, because I haven't done a lot of thinking on this, but like, I think you could at least tentatively say it could cut 50-50. You could give a naturalistic or even reductionistic account that doesn't, that could lead you to go, yeah, well, this doesn't demand I think God exists. And you could also give a theistic account that can explain why the desire is there. I think you could reasonably predict the existence of the desire on a naturalistic, reductionistic account and on a theistic account. That's all I'm trying to say.
so that's interesting. There's kind of a falsification worry here, right? Because like I mean, presumably we have a bunch of desires that seem hardwired or natural. Um, And for us to say that there's objects for those desires seems a little bit implausible. There's no way for us to falsify that because who knows, maybe it could be there, right? And so what we need to look for if we were going to test this out is maybe we have a hardwired desire for a thing not to be the case, and then we find it to be the case, and all of a sudden we falsified our principle, right? And that might make us want to revise the principle and be more specific and add more fine print. And that might be an interesting
That's
project.
true. I also think some other worries about the argument is you might think that a certain formulation of the problem of evil or divine hiddenness might serve as defeaters for the plausibility. Like, for instance, imagine if you grant everything that Lewis asks you to grant. Imagine if you grant that we do have a longing for transcendence. We do have a longing for something in this world that exists beyond this world. You might also have independent reasons for going, yeah, I have this desire, but also evil's a huge problem.
Yeah.
There seems to be gratuitous evil. Also, the problem with divine hiddenness is a big issue. So that it could be that you could grant everything Lewis wants you to grant, but you also could have other considerations for why you think that there may not be a perfect being
Well,
beyond.
who said that transcendence, entailed perfection?
Well, well, well. I know you like talking about forms of theism that don't entail like
Well,
perfect
look,
being.
just take C.S. Lewis's version or
Yeah,
any of the original versions. Like none of them commit themselves to the perfect being in that argument specifically.
yeah.
Maybe they do.
But
Maybe they do.
like because I know Lewis held the perfect being theology. Like it, if you think that perfect being theology or perfect being theism is like um what is entailed by that argument. I mean, I think you could plausibly make it for a finite theistic conception of God, but for the sake of this discussion, if we tailor it towards perfect being theism, my
Yeah, then the
only point
divine.
being is that
Yeah.
atheological concerns, like different formulations of the problem of evil and divine hiddenness, could serve as defeaters for you
Yeah.
making the jump and saying, yeah, this object of desire is a perfect being. Like that was my only point to give other pushback toward.
So that this is interesting because we talked about this before the podcast, right? But if we're taking two worldviews and throwing them up against each other, and we're excluding other worldviews, right? That's kind of interesting because we can take two arguments and see which one would win out, right? So we have the fine tuning argument, and then we have the argument from gratuitous evil or something, and it's like, well, which one's going to be more powerful? And that's a really interesting. And then you're kind of asked, well, how much power does this argument have, right? And honestly, I feel like if you were just weighing the two theories, I mean, like this would I don't know if maybe the problem of evil would, but something like divine hiddenness wouldn't have enough power to.
Well,
I don't know.
we briefly talked about this before the podcast. Um, you could, in principle, use the argument from desire to even potentially undermine the problem of divine hiddenness and say that this desire that you have actually is a form of knowledge of God. Like
Yeah,
that is how God
yeah, yeah. That's so.
that is how God is revealing himself to you as a non-resistant non-believer. And perhaps the argument from desire also can motivate you to affirm some kind of skeptical theism where you say, I don't know what God's reasons are for allowing evil, but I have a desire in myself for something that nothing in this world can satisfy. So I guess I have a desire for a world in which there is an answer to the problem of evil.
Yeah,
And even if I don't have the answer right now, perhaps the argument from desire can motivate a skeptical theism or serve as a rational foundation for some sort of skeptical theism. And so
yeah,
maybe it can even be used to undermine the two concerns that I gave from the problem of evil or the problem of divine hiddenness. Um,
yeah.
so,
Yeah, that's very fast. I mean, I was just going to bring up a very different point. But so from in this argument, we're inferring from the fact that our natural desires have objects to the fact that we have a desire for God, right? But there's actually another way you can arrive at God, like another pathway, like a back door or something. And you kind of touched on it earlier. But the sheer fact that we have a desire for that kind of thing at all, right, is highly surprising, on naturalism. Like, why would we just want that thing, right? And so it seems there needs to be some kind of being that cares about us that would want us to have that desire, right? Because I'm not seeing evolution over here just
well,
instilling
also
us.
something that could serve as a defeater for like an evolutionary naturalistic account for it is we almost seem to find ourselves in a world where we're fine tuned to desire. No,
Yeah,
I'm not even
yeah,
trying to troll or anything like that. It's like
yeah, yeah,
we seem to be fine tuned to desire transcendence.
yeah,
And you have to be able to give a plausible account for why we have that desire. And
Mm,
we could do what you did and try to undermine the belief that the object of transcendence is God or that it's a desire for God. But the desire for transcendence does have to be accounted for. And theism's answer to the desire that Lewis is talking about is, well, you desire for transcendence because God exists. God wants you to know that he exists, and God wants you to have that desire for transcendence satisfied by a relationship with him. And the reason why you have this desire is because he made you to have it. So that would be theism's account. And I think it is a simple account, even if you don't think it's true, or if someone doesn't think it's true. I do think it is provides a simple account for why the desire
yeah,
is there.
yeah. I mean, I think the thing that I would want to explore more, because there's something that's just strange to me, because it just feels like the desire for eternality or the desire for us to not die. That just feels kind of different than a desire for food. Something about it. They're both natural, right? So
Yeah.
maybe the natural experience distinction isn't good, but that's something that I would just explore more. Like if I were to, yeah, I don't know.
But one other thing, and I don't know when you want to wrap this up. But
I actually have like a few like
sure,
interesting things
I,
I want to
I
ask
just
you,
want
but
I just wanted to say one more thing. Like, if God does exist, and if perfect being theism is true, and God wants a relationship with all of humanity in a non-coercive way, where we can like freely respond
yeah, yeah,
without coercion or anything like that, you have to ask yourself, well, what would that being do to ensure the possibility of that kind of knowledge? And I think the argument from desire, or the experience that we find in the argument from desire, actually fits like a hand in the glove, a hand
yeah,
in the glove for what we would expect if God exists and wanted to provide a an avenue, as it were, for one to obtain non-coercive knowledge of God, if that makes sense.
yeah. That's so fascinating. This argument is like a well of so many topics that you could explore. That's so fascinating. Um, no, okay. So I mean, let's. This is kind of a thing I wanted to ask about. What I just wrote this down. What do you think it would be like to experience transcendence? Like when we actually get it. So we want this thing, and there's an object to it. Let's say we get it. Like, what do you think? What do you think it's going to be like? What is it like to be a bat? What is it like to be a Christian?
Yeah.
After
So,
the
like the transcendence that Lewis had in mind, I don't know. I really don't know, because that's part of like the Christian hope for eternal life, is that it's going to be, as the book of Revelation says, there's going to be no more tears, no more pain. I actually see it as the philosopher Jerry Walls wrote a book on heaven, and he talked about it's going to be a world where the best stories have yet to be told, the best movies have yet to be made, the best music has yet to be written,
yeah,
the best journeys have yet to begin. So perhaps it is continuity with the world we find ourselves in now without the presence of evil. And that is what the transcendence, perhaps, that we're longing,
that's so
that
fascinating.
Lewis is talking about in the argument from desire.
Because like that question stemmed from a different question, and I wrote down 2 weeks ago. Like, in what ways does prayer and reading scripture and doing other things, how does that not fulfill your desire? Or maybe you think it does fulfill the desire. You know what I'm saying? And much in the same way that perceiving a sunset doesn't exactly fulfill the desire because it cultivates a different desire, something beyond our world. Who knows?
If you
Um,
want me to put my Christian hat on for a moment, like just
by all means.
not like a general theist hat, like I think perhaps someone's wondering, it's like, okay, I've had this longing for transcendence, but it ebbs, it flows, it comes, it goes. Like, how would I even cultivate that desire to even have knowledge of God or expand upon knowledge of God? As a Christian, I actually think that the cultivating that desire that Lewis is talking about, the desire for transcendence, I actually think you can cultivate that desire through loving your neighbor as yourself, loving your enemy, caring for the poor in society, caring for what Jesus called the least of these, those who are marginalized in our society. Because it's interesting. Jesus says in John 3, unless someone is born again, they won't see the kingdom of God. But when you look at the rest of the Gospels, what does that kingdom look like? It's a kingdom filled with people who love their enemies, love their neighbors, they care for the downtrodden, they care for the least of these in society. And Jesus says, if you're not born again, you won't see any of these things. So he's making an epistemic claim there. And
Mm.
so perhaps the key to if Christianity is true, which is a whole other podcast.
Hmm.
For my own context as a Christian, I think you cultivate that desire for transcendence by loving your neighbor, loving your enemy, caring for the least of these in society, because I think they reflect a kingdom that Jesus himself said is not of this world.
Yeah.
And thus you can cultivate that desire for transcendence by living out a kingdom that is in and of itself transcendent to this world. But that's my Christian hat on as a
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. No. One point I really appreciate that I didn't think about and I didn't come across is the point about cultivating the desire and suppressing the desire. Like that's so real. Yeah. Well, what implications does this argument have for living?
so let me do the more abstract applications first before we get into the
Okay.
practical. So I think from an abstract standpoint, I think it potentially could show that um, the claim that non-resistant non-belief exists, it could falsify that claim.
Okay.
Because it could be that if you're experiencing that desire that Lewis is talking about, but you choose not to cultivate the desire or respond to the desire
Mm.
positive,
Okay.
I think it could be a way that you're suppressing the truth. I think, or that's too harsh, but you're resisting at a bare minimum.
Yeah.
You're resisting the possibility of knowledge of God.
So that's it's one thing to resist a whole religion with a bunch of truth claims. Another thing to resist the pursuit of truth, beauty, and goodness, right?
Yeah,
And so if you're a little honest about it, then it doesn't seem
yeah.
plausible
I
that
don't want
you know.
again use this argument solely as like an argument for Christianity, but for theism generally. If
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah, yeah,
let's say that the argument from desire is God's way, that He wants someone to begin a relationship with Him.
yeah,
In those moments where you experience that inconsolable longing that Lewis talked about, I actually think you do have a choice whether or not you're going to, like I talked about earlier in the podcast, commit
yeah,
commit to God, commit to pursuing what the object of that desire is, or you could just resist that.
You know, that's interesting because it just does seem plausible that the only non-resistant non-believers in that circumstance will be people who are like mentally handicapped in some way.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like that's interesting. Yeah,
But also another more practical aspect would be um, you really it is possible that you could have knowledge of God if you respond to this desire when you experience it. And if God does exist, to put my my pastoral hat on for a moment, like
yeah,
uh, it's the greatest thing imaginable. You could have knowledge in a relationship, knowledge of a perfect being in a relationship with a perfect being who actually does care about you. And I think that the argument from desire could be an opportunity for one to have that kind of knowledge and that kind of relationship. So that's to answer the
yeah,
question of the practical implication
yeah.
of
And I suppose to acknowledge it as a desire that is significant and a desire that might mean
and
that some kind
yeah, and
of
even if God doesn't exist, I still think the desire itself is significant. And it
mm,
does
yeah, yeah, fair,
I think
fair.
like let's for a moment say that theism isn't true. I think we would still have that desire. But I think one thing that the desire does show at a bare minimum is that we're different from all the other animals.
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
that your goldfish is not reflecting on their mortality or the
yeah,
possibility of eternal life. But as human creatures, we're able to contemplate our own death, contemplate our own meaning, and contemplate whether or not that meaning extends beyond this life. And so, at a bare minimum, I think what the argument does do is show that there is something unique about human beings, that there's
yeah,
something about us that separates us from all the other animals in the animal kingdom.
yeah. And I appreciate the more modest implication, and I think specifically, I mean, if it does show that like there is some kind of being, like it's possible to suppress your desire to pursue that, right? And maybe the being isn't, a god of the Old Testament. I mean, maybe it's something a little more, I don't know, a little better, something you might want to pursue. So that's kind of interesting.
I think we're at a place where we could wrap things up if you want to. If
Yeah,
we keep on going, we could. But also,
that was kind of my move to
I,
wrap things up.
I think we've covered a
Just
lot of ground.
implications.
If I had to say one more thing, yeah, if you find yourself with this desire, the desire that Lewis said, it's for something that nothing else in this world can satisfy. My advice would be pursue that desire, see
Yeah,
where it leads you. And as someone who is a theist, I believe that following that desire will ultimately lead you to God. And as a Christian, I believe that the pursuit of that desire will lead to the person of Christ, who brought transcendence and immanence together, who brought infinity, infinitude together in the incarnation. And that's all
yeah.
I have.
I mean, Yeah, I mean, I guess suppose I would be remiss if I didn't mention this one thing that I had in my notes. Like, if the argument gets off the ground, saying that our desire for transcendence doesn't have an object would be like saying chords played on the piano don't have resolutions, right? We would just live in a world where there would be no resolution to a subdominant or like a 5/7 chord, and that would just be a really strange world to live in, right? And so, if the argument gets off the ground, technically or maybe more abstractly, like that's very interesting.
Agreed.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. John. We're gonna have to have you on again at some point in the future. We're both very busy, but
Well,
who knows?
this has been a lot of
Yeah,
fun.
yeah, cool. Well, have a great day, Mr. John.
Take care, Wade.